last week, I celebrated the 10th anniversary of moving from the UK to the US, and in the time since, I've gone through a bit of a cultural assimilation, as any person does when they move from one place to another. And just as my wife, 11 years earlier, went through her own assimilation of UK culture when she moved from the US to the UK, I've had to learn to deal with a lot of things that are different. Some of them are different good, and some of them are different bad. And look, I know that Kate, Elliot and she moved to the US about 4 months after us because, like me, she is married to an American, often tease and sometimes mock the country we currently call home, but we also say pretty much equally horrid things about the country we're both born in, so take from that what you will. But I also know that while living in the US today can be a challenge, there are some really good things about living here. One of the more frustrating things about living in the US, and we've covered this a fair amount in the last 10 years, is the fact that the current US regulatory environment around cars is incredibly protectionist and an abject lesson in unintended consequences. While it's been possible for a number of years to import cars from the US to Europe, as long as you're doing so in very small volumes or as an individual, and you go through some specific modifications to ensure your vehicle complies with lighting standards and some basic pedestrian and occupant safety standards, it happens to be nigh on impossible to import cars to the US from Europe. Part of the reason it's so difficult to import a Cybertruck to Europe is that Europe doesn't like sharp edges on vehicles, sharp enough to cut you. Although the question of why you would want to bring a badly built, unreliable, overpriced trash can to Europe at the cost of over $100,000 is beyond the scope of this video. And that's led to many a frustrated conversation about we'd love X or Y car to be available in the US because it would be better suited to our own personal needs than the current vehicles we've got. For example, the Nissan ENV200 would have been an amazing family-friendly electric van for my family when we moved over here in 2015 because it had room in the back for our elderly dogs, plenty of family-friendly space up front, and a reasonably good range for what we needed at the time. Yet outside of a small test fleet of vehicles operated by my local utility company, Portland General Electric, the ENV200 was never officially offered for sale in the US because Nissan decided to not homologate it for the US market because US safety tests are so very different to European ones. In fact, the only way, currently, that you can get a European spec car imported to the US is to import it as a vehicle collector, in which case you're only allowed to drive it a few hundred miles a year, or import it as an automaker for testing and benchmarking, which is how Jim Farley, CEO of Ford, got to enjoy a Xiaomi SU7 while the rest of us can't even get a BYD Dolphin, or temporarily import it for a limited time under a special program designed to accommodate round-the-world travellers. Or finally, you can wait 25 years when, spectacularly overnight, said vehicle suddenly becomes magically safe for use on US roads. Interestingly, when Kate was moving over, she actually worked with Mitsubishi to see if there was a way she could bring her pre-production Mitsubishi i-MiEV over because she loved it so much. After they'd excitedly exclaimed that they would love to help, even they had to admit that there was no realistic route for her car to join her 60-year-old Morris Minor in the shipping container. And I did try to do the exact same thing with my first Nissan Leaf ahead of Kate. There's no rules in the US, at least in Oregon, about prohibiting right-hand drive vehicles from being registered, so when I went to move to the US, I examined the possibility of bringing my very first generation Nissan Leaf to the US with us. After all, the Leaf was sold in the US, and I assumed I could just modify the Leaf to US spec and be good. On paper, that seemed entirely plausible because, unlike the UK spec iMIV, which is different to the US version, the UK market Nissan Leaf was basically the same as the US version, save for some light changes and some door bing changes, the steering wheel being on the other side of the vehicle, and a few other things that should be easily fixable. But no. It wasn't. And if that doesn't smack of protectionism, well, I've got a bridge to sell you. But last week, a news story came across my desk that made me stop and go, what? A story that suggests the US and the EU are actually about to come to an agreement regarding vehicle standards that maybe might open the door for European market vehicles to be legal for US roads without requiring additional testing, while the opposite will become true for US cars in Europe. Here's what we know, what we don't know, and why I think it will still be very difficult to import cars from one region to the other for a really long time. So about 2 weeks ago, the US and the EU had some meetings in which apparently the US managed to twist the EU's arm over vehicle imports. The official statement from the US White House, full of the usual rah, rah, America, F, yeah language that's become the What do you mean? I was going to say de rigueur. Yes, I know what it means. It means expected by society. What do you mean I can't use it? Who said it was elitist? In the comments, right. Did they? Oh, US, right. And that's going to help the US with running out of the top 20 happiest right? Yes, I am American. And I'm also British. And Canadian. And language is... Never mind. If you get beyond the language, you'll notice that in addition to some promises about sharing technology and products and produce and getting mates rates for import taxes, the UK, US and EU appear to have come to an agreement that could, if followed through, mean that European market vehicles will be capable of being sold in the US without first going through US emissions and crash test standards, and the opposite for US-made cars in Europe. But as is often the case with diplomatic procedures, especially where the US is involved, what is said in trumped-up announcements and what is actually done, or indeed doable, can be wholly different beasts. So today, I'm going to try my best to explain the current situation, explain how it came about, look at what's new in this agreement and what seems to be suggesting could happen, examine the implications of this for both the US and Europe, and then explain why, even though it pains me greatly to admit it, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference in the real world. So let's start at the beginning, because it's a very good place to start. First, a little history of crash testing and vehicle safety. The idea of keeping vehicle occupants safe goes back almost as far as the automotive industry itself. Early racing cars sometimes had simple lap belts to keep drivers in their seat when things got a little hairy, but production vehicles didn't really see any form of restraints until the 1940s and 50s. Back then, some automakers did include lap belts, mainly to stop people from sliding around, and they offered almost no protection for the rest of the body and certainly couldn't prevent serious injuries. They just kept your bottom planted into the seat. Somewhat notoriously, in fact, Alec Izagonis, designer of the Mini and Morris Minor, felt that anti-burst door locks, those are door locks that keep doors closed during an accident, were totally unnecessary because good drivers simply wouldn't be involved in any kind of collision. Around that same time, automakers and engineers began experimenting with sleds, weights, and other contraptions to simulate crashes. Those tests were part academic, part practical, but systemic safety testing for everyday passengers was still very much in its infancy. By the mid-1930s, some engineers had begun to realise that seat belts could do more than just hold people in place. They could actually save lives, and it wasn't until 1959 that Volvo engineer Niels Bohlin invented the modern three-point seatbelt, the design that we still basically use today, which restrained both the lower and upper body. Volvo even made that patent freely available to encourage the global adoption of real occupant protection. Who would do that today? As automakers began exploring ways to keep occupants safe, lawmakers realised that specifying clear safety standards could turn these features from nice-to-have extras into mandatory protections that would actually reduce automotive deaths, and you can make some solid economic and ethical arguments for protections that save lives, allowing legislators who cared about either of those things to come together. In the US, this push was fueled by Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed campaign, which exposed the dangers of poorly designed cars. Congress responded with the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966, which gave the government the authority to set vehicle safety standards. The first mandatory regulations, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, went into effect in 1970, requiring automakers to comply with specific prescriptive measures. Essentially, your vehicle must behave this way in this situation to protect occupants. Meanwhile, European automakers are also experimenting with safety, but regulation was more fragmented, handled on a per-country basis. It wasn't really until the 1990s that the European Union introduced Euro NCAP, a unified European crash test rating system. And unlike the US approach, which prescribes exact requirements, Euro NCAP tends to focus on outcomes. Rather than specifying exactly how a car must behave, it assesses whether occupants would experience a certain level of injury in a crash. And I've just given a very basic 100,000-foot view of this all. There are nuances I've not really gone into, but for the most part, the US and European crash test standards have developed along parallel, if notably very different lines. From a distance, you might assume they both carry the same kind of tests, both require vehicles to pass frontal, side, offset and occupant protection tests, and both require some form of testing for pedestrian protection. But the level of testing is vastly different. I should also note here that the US testing also requires a whole different approach to airbags, because in Europe, airbags are used as supplemental restraints alongside seatbelts because sane and well-adjusted folks use seatbelts so that emergency medical personnel don't have to scrape the vehicle's former occupant remnants off the road surface. And the law in Europe reflects that fact. In the US, because freedom and America requiring seatbelts to be worn is seen as an infringement by some on their personal liberties, and while most states do require seatbelts be worn, it's not actually a nationwide thing, and thus airbags are still required to act as primary restraints. Add to that fact the sad fact that your average American is bigger than the average European, and airbag requirements are very, very different over here. Oh, and in the US, because it loves massive cars and SUVs, there are a bunch of rollover tests that most European manufacturers don't have to worry about. Something Ford Explorer? By the way, did you know that in 13 US states, while it's required that you wear a seatbelt, the police can't stop you and cite you for it. They can cite you if they pull you over for something else, but they can't stop you for not wearing a seatbelt. And while we're generally in favour of minimising police interactions with the public for minor infractions, and nobody here is in favour of the police stopping people for such things, Kate also says, please wear a bloody seatbelt, because she doesn't like picking glass out of people's faces. Nor does she like explaining how a survivable accident ended up in death because someone didn't bother to clunk click. Both of which, by the way, have happened in places she's worked. And also, in case you were wondering, New Hampshire is special. It is the only US state where adults aren't legally required to wear seatbelts anymore. It really does put the whole live free or die state motto into context. I know it comes from the US Revolution, but it's just a little ironic. Perhaps they should change that or to an and. So now we're at the US and EU safety laws are a different part of our conversation. But for the most part, and I know many people won't like this, the European crash test standards are more realistic. For example, in the US, NHTSA tests focus on how a car fares when it sustains a side impact by being hit with a moving barrier at around 33 to 38 miles per hour, which is intended to simulate a T-bone collision at an intersection. The IIHS does a similar thing. It includes small and moderate overlap tests, but the focus is still largely on occupant survival. European tests, on the other hand, look at what happens to the occupants when a deformable barrier hits the car, which better mimics elastic car-to-car impacts because, that's how physics works. European tests also study whiplash injury prevention by examining head restraints. In the US, rear impact and whiplash testing is not actually required by NHTSA, although IIHS does cover it. Considering rear impacts are among one of the most common collisions today, this is an area where European tests are literally streets ahead. Europe also takes pedestrian impacts seriously. US tests largely focus on whether the vehicle occupants survive a collision with little to no regard paid to other road users, while European tests analyse the mechanisms of injury common to pedestrian car impacts and measure the likelihood of head, upper body and leg injuries both to occupants and to pedestrians. And of course, lest I forget, US crash tests only apply to light-duty cars and trucks, basically anything of under £8,500 GVWR. Vehicles above that weight, which can include some full-size pickups, large SUVs, and does include vehicles like the Hummer EV, Cadillac Escalade, F-150 Lightning, and Cybertruck, aren't subject to those same kind of crash test standards as the run-of-the-mill family hatchback that the US auto industry has brought to the precipice of extinction. This is the long tail of the chicken tax and emissions regulations that focused on cars, not the, at the time, unpopular SUVs and pickup trucks. The too long didn't read version is that automakers have long lobbied safety organisations and lawmakers to limit some of the stricter safety tests for these heavier vehicles, meaning they have more leeway in design because, well, America, profits are more important than people. All in all, European crash testing tends to look at how injuries happen, not just whether people survive, which makes it a whole lot more comprehensive and a more realistic approach. And we're going to put all of this on the back burner here for a moment, because we're going to come back to the implications for allowing each other's safety standards in a moment. But first, emissions. I think you probably know that Europe and the US have very different regulations when it comes to emissions. Not only does Europe have far stricter emission standards, cars sold in Europe must have far lower emissions on average than any US models, but they also must adhere to stricter fuel economy targets. Diesel vehicles, especially, must also go through tougher testing requirements for particulates and NOx, while modification of vehicle systems by owners carry a far tougher penalty for aftermarket tweaks that worsen emissions. Since Europe also has far stricter policies for checking vehicles are safe to be on the road once they're a few years old, this is also enforced in a way that would be alien to many US states. And while European fuel economy tests are often viewed as over-optimistic and pretty unrealistic in the real world, European emissions tests aren't lab-based. They can also include on-road testing to mimic how vehicles will behave in the real world. And all of this is good and okay. I mean, while European emissions tests are stricter, the US was heading in the right direction with its emissions test programs. But that is very much likely going to change at the hands of the Enriching Polluters Association as the EPA has effectively become. The agency is currently going through a consultation period, as promised by President Trump, to eliminate the 2009 endangerment finding that the EPA has used since then to set and mandate emissions policy and environmental protections. While the public consultation period is still open, and Kate made a fantastic video on it just here, and 4 full days of public hearings saw literally hundreds of people speak out against removing the endangerment finding, with only 20 people speaking in favour of yeeting it to the curb. We know that the US White House, well, I mean, it's kind of proving that it's not going to listen to its pesky little citizens. It's going to listen to its friends in the fossil fuel industry, and that means US emission standards are not going to improve. They're going to get much worse. Again, I want you to tuck that into your little brain cubbyhole next to the thing about crash tests, and now let's look at the thing that the US and EU seem to have come to a tentative agreement on when it comes to vehicles. So, as per a statement issued on August 21st, which said, with respect to automobiles, the United States and the European Union intend to accept and provide mutual recognition to each other's standards. And look, that's part of a plan to address something that President Trump has moaned about time and time again, how Europeans aren't allowed, and yes, that is air quotes I'm using, to buy US cars, which is ironic considering that Jeep, Ford, Cadillac, Tesla and plenty of other American brands are sold in the EU. In contrast, many of Europe's largest automakers simply don't sell in the US. Of course, what the president actually meant was that American cars aren't allowed to be sold in the EU without first going through homologation, a process that is expensive and, for gas-guzzling SUVs and slab-fronted pickup trucks with their attendant pedestrian risks, almost impossible to pass. And while the official trade agreement, as signed not so long ago, makes overtures to the fact that the US and the EU will work together to acknowledge and accept each other's safety and emission standards, 2 things. 1. For a very long time, the EU and the US have discussed reaching some kind of compromise on vehicle standards, and 2, I can't honestly see how this is all going to work. For a start, before we even get to the fact that EU emissions laws will effectively be negated if US cars flood the market, there are some pretty fundamental differences in how European and US cars approach lighting. In the US, and this does bug me a lot, automakers are allowed to use either red or amber rear lights for indicators, meaning cars like my Chevrolet Bolt has an amber indicator at the rear, but my Ford F-150 Lightning has a red indicator that also doubles as a brake light. Technology Connections had a great video on this, by the way. And yes, don't ask, I agree with Alec. It's stupid. European cars, meanwhile, have tighter regulations on light beam patterns with specific blocked-out areas of headlights to prevent dazzling oncoming traffic. The US? It does not. And at this point, a rant. I don't know why the US hasn't adopted the European light reflector patterns. Because they're safer, they illuminate the road better and allow, at least I think, for a slightly longer headlight throw in the offside portion of the lane. But no, it is totally okay in the US to have headlights that blind other people on oncoming traffic. And for what it's worth, most states don't insist that people learn the difference between side lights, high beams, dipped beams, and fog lights. So if you're somewhere where lifted trucks are a thing, like rural Oregon, good luck seeing the road ahead at night when someone comes up behind you with the deer-killing 10 billion lumen LED lights on the front of their truck. There are plenty of other little tweaks and differences as well. European cars tend towards tougher lockouts if you're not wearing a seatbelt. US cars, meanwhile, scream at you if the car is on and the door is open. And, well, I could go on, but I won't. even before we get to the crash tests and emissions. The rules regarding what is and isn't okay in a vehicle are different enough that automakers who make cars for different markets must either make different components for different parts of the world or add things that one market doesn't actually require that is in another, like fog lights, for example. They are mandatory in Europe, and they're really a very good idea. They're not required in the US. So in adopting each other's standards, or at least allowing cars from the other market to be imported and sold without any extra modification, it's gonna cause some significant issues across vast areas. Laws will need to be rewritten. Guidance will either need to be rescinded or revised, and you can bet that insurance companies, who, believe it or not, do have a massive say in how vehicle standards are set because their whole shtick is risk avoidance, will need to be placated before your regular consumer in either market can buy a vehicle from the other market without facing massive differences in their insurance. And it will invite a race to the bottom in standards. What's the bare minimum that will meet all of the easiest bits of the rules? I just cannot see this happening. The agreement just says the EU and the US will work together to adopt each other's standards. It doesn't actually explain how. And the EU member states will also have to buy in, which honestly seems pretty unlikely. Allowing US-approved vehicles on European roads is already a headache. Enthusiasts do import US cars, but as the wonderful Johnny Smith's review of the Ford F-150 Lightning showed, a truck that is massive in the US is positively ridiculous in Europe. Many roads are simply too narrow, and even when Ford homologates the Lightning for some European countries, which it does, getting to drive one can require you need a higher class license, and there are many limits that are enforced over what you can tow or carry because many European countries restrict the ability to drive larger, heavier vehicles to a separate, harder driving test. And now let's go back to the emissions. If the agreement means any US car approved in the US can be sold in the EU, and assuming EPA rollbacks happen, people are going to be capable of driving massive diesel pickups and SUVs that exceed even decades-old European standards. And that's before even considering the impact on pedestrians and other road users from vehicles whose frontal area can best be described as widow-making. So, yeah, this good news is really bad news for Europe, but it's also worth noting that I personally can't think of many Europeans who would willingly opt for a US spec vehicle just because. I mean, yes, of course, you're going to have outliers, but this isn't an agreement designed to open the door for US automakers to Europe, especially in the face of cheaper Chinese-made vehicles, which have made significant inroads into the European market. The US has not yet shown any ability or desire to compete with any of those vehicles on the combination of quality-price features. Expecting Europeans to buy a car with worse economy that's much more expensive to fuel, and less well-equipped for the dubious value of a Dodge badge? It's unlikely to be a winner. I think it's actually more likely we're going to see the opposite happening. The US auto industry is woefully inadequate when it comes to affordable city cars. Europe has plenty of them, and if we look at the EV world, which we most certainly are, this new agreement could lead to imports of more affordable electric models from Europe. Under this proposed agreement, we could see cars like the Volkswagen ID.3 make it across the pond, or the Opel Corsa, or the Citroën C4 Aircross, or perhaps, maybe even Chinese marques like MG and BYD. Although I'd suspect that will come with a caveat that the car has to actually be made in Europe rather than shipped over from China. But, and this is a massive but, importing any car from Europe to the US, even if the US agrees that any car that's road legal in the EU is road legal in the US, isn't just a case of throwing it on a ship and waving it goodbye at the docks. European EVs use different physical connectors to US cars, and while there are basic physical differences between the inlets on vehicles, there are some not so subtle differences between the way the charging stations work and talk to the vehicles that would also need to be overcome. Of course, that is just a piece of software code away from a fix, but other things, like Europe's three-phase charging capabilities, would remain completely untapped in the US, and some might argue would put those European cars on an uneven playing field against US models. That could leave some automakers at a disadvantage or facing a tough decision. Fix the tiny things that are different before export, which could also put the price up, or just leave it to the owners. In both cases, aftermarket sales and service could become a real headache. Some vehicles are already hard to service in certain markets, and particularly when it comes to modern cars, where servicing tends to require a cornucopia of special tools in addition to substantial training commitments, dealerships may very well be reticent to dive in and start supporting the service and sale of a new brand that's got not much history in the market and isn't even bothering to produce vehicles tailored to that market. So whether it's European cars in the US, where support tends to be patchy, or US cars in Europe, I honestly don't see this becoming a mainstream practical business option. At least, not anytime soon. Case in point, before moving to the US, we owned a Nissan Leaf and a European spec Chevrolet Volt in right-hand drive. The Leaf was easy, any Nissan garage would touch it. The Chevrolet Volt, well, despite its sibling, the Vauxhall Ampera, being sold and serviced across the UK, only 3 garages in the country would work on my Volt. By the time we sold it, there were a grand total of 2 Volt dealerships in the entire UK. Same car, same factory, and same year. Yet, good luck getting it serviced. In an ideal world, this new agreement could make it easier for people in the US to get European cars that are right-sized for their needs, for more electric hatchbacks to arrive, and for much more consumer choice. And that would be amazing. But given requirements for servicing and aftermarket sales, and given the very different way in which many consumers view cars in those 2 different markets, I honestly can't see many automakers jumping at this chance. Instead, I expect, if this does come to pass, for individuals and small independent outlets to jump on the bandwagon and start importing more EVs to the US from Europe. And because European cars are safer and have lower emissions, that will be beneficial to Americans. But honestly, this feels like something we've seen before. Placation of a bully by making promises that may prove impossible to keep. Because I just don't see that many European nations jumping on a bandwagon to make the air less clean, their streets less safe, and their roads more crowded. Thanks for joining me today, and if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them in our Discord chat room, on our Patreon page, down below, on our blog, or you can reach out to us on Mastodon or Blue Sky. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling by on your screen right now. They are part of the massive community of supporters who make this channel possible, helping us through Patreon and YouTube, covering our bills, paying our team, and helping us to remain 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here, just follow the link below. We've got options available across a wide range of different price points, from just $1.50 US a month. A massive welcome to our newest supporters: M. Wessie, Les Magnar, MX Flounder, NYTMR, Thrill Nelly, Hernan Giraldo, Christopher Bloodworth, Eric Rouvier, Ronnie E. Bickers Jr., Brett Mason, George Piney, Mega XLR, Robert Coghill, Peter Bodica, Gary Wood, Dessa Bird Traveller, Tim van der Loeng, Mike Clark, Kyle Olin, Rob Hutchinson, Tony Ladig, Chris Nichols, Tempus, Adrian Atwater, Doug Lloyd, Mitch Rasner, and Brad. To join the list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member for your moment of fame, and you can even gift membership to someone else. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations, and we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at. Address on our website. You'll also find links to our swag store, and if you're someone who has to shop on Amazon, please consider using our affiliate link so we get the commission, not Jeff Bezos. So we can continue to focus on making our content even better and reduce burnout, we are being a little freer with our release days, but plan on dropping new content every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday on our main channel, plus something on Sunday over on TE Take 2. If you want more, the mighty algorithm that hates us thinks you should be watching this video, but we think this one is one you should also check out. Be awesome, be kind, be intentional, and don't forget to resist. Keep evolving.